Does the government exist for the benefit of the people, or do the people exist for the benefit of the government? Can government wage war on behalf of Americans without their consent? Tonight, a humanitarian crisis as the excuse for America at war in Libya. Over the past weekend, the United States began to bomb Libya. This act of war, executed in concert with the governments of France, the United Kingdom, and others under the auspices of the United Nations Security Council, represents a new frontier in American military adventurism. President Obama did not seek or receive the approval of the Congress, even though in 2007, as a United States Senator, he said, quote, "The president does not have power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation," close quote. What he understood then, but rejects now, is that under the Constitution, only the Congress, not the president, not the United Nations, not a humanitarian crisis, can send the U.S. into war. And the U.S. can only go to war when it has been attacked or is imminently threatened. Even under the most liberal and expansive interpretation of what is an imminent threat, Libya cannot be understood to pose one to the United States. Its oil reserves, the largest in Africa, are peacefully exported to Europe and here, while it is the country of origin for the Mujahideen fighting as far as Somalia and Afghanistan. There has not been any evidence that Colonel Gaddafi condones or supports them. And according to former President Bush and former British Prime Minister Blair, Gaddafi and his country have been partners with the United States in the global war on terror since the mid-2000s. Further, the military operation in Libya was not the culmination of any concerted effort to beat the drums of war by U.S. military leadership. On the contrary, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, when testifying on Capitol Hill on the application of a no-fly zone to Libya, warned lawmakers eager, quote, to do something about Libya that a no-fly zone had as a necessary prerequisite an actual attack on Libya, an attack we began on Saturday. And shortly before that, at a speech at West Point, he warned that any future Secretary of Defense who would recommend a U.S. military invasion in Asia, the Middle East, or North Africa, quote, ought to have his head examined, close quote. This military operation we began on Saturday cannot even feign to be a war of preemption. It is instead purely a war of choice. It is also unconstitutional. Congress did not declare war on Libya. And while treaties such as the ones governing our relationship with the United Nations may be given the force of law by the Constitution, no treaty may permit the federal government to act outside the confines of the Constitution. Since not even the president can argue that Libya is a threat to U.S. national security, he has no legal basis for his invasion. It's not a war, he'll argue. We're just leveling the playing fields, just helping the good guys. Let's see. $100 million in military hardware rained down from the skies onto Libyan civilians and military in one weekend. If that's not an act of war, then sinking the Lusitania or bombing Pearl Harbor were not acts of war. And to think that the UN can unleash American military, but not the United States Congress, is not only ridiculous, it is a rejection of the president's oath to uphold the Constitution. But, cry advocates of intervention, the situation in Libya represents a humanitarian crisis and therefore demands that the governments of people of conscience intervene to help the good guys. But no one in the West knows who we're helping. And the crisis in Libya, though it may be the most prominent one in the media, is hardly a unique humanitarian crisis in the world today. Today in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, in Yemen, in the Ivory Coast, citizens are facing military attacks on their peaceful demands for meaningful political reforms. And in perhaps the most disastrous UN-initiated humanitarian aid in history, North Koreans are facing a nearly 60-year nightmare that has seen their country deteriorate from just another communist dictatorship into a totalitarian monstrosity, unique in its anti-humanity. That's because in 1950, the United Nations Security Council opened the door to foreign intervention in what was then primarily a civil war in Korea. And the UN action in that civil war, just as the UN action in the Libyan civil war, was not even legitimate under the standards of the United Nations Charter, which prohibits the UN from intervening in internal affairs such as civil wars. In the meantime, the United Nations has now caused the entry of the United States military into a fifth Muslim nation. We are, after all, still in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we are killing civilians in Pakistan with our drones and pistols, and we are known to be executing military operations in Yemen. In none of these cases has the Congress declared war. What ought to guide and inform us when we decide to use military force is the interest and safety of the American people. We must reject the legitimacy of the United Nations in leading the United States into foreign interventions, and we must oppose President Obama's unconstitutional and illegal deployment of military assets in Libya. In foreign policy, President Obama is providing more evidence that he is the third term of President George W. Bush. He warned the people that if elected, Senator John McCain would become. And making it even clearer that Democrats and Republicans are two wings of the same war party. And that war party, in its prosecution of wars of choice abroad, threatens our freedom and the freedom of people around the world. Americans cannot afford to put gas in the tanks in their cars, and we are bombing the people who own oil fields. From New York, watching the government and